Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Minority Report's podcast and digital series. I am your host, Mona Sheikh. Very excited to be here. My eye makeup, I kind of went a little overboard today, but I like it. I kind of like, because I'm home all day, I have zero interaction with human beings. This is what I do to make myself happy, you guys. Just lather on just a bunch of makeup just to make myself happy. Okay? This is what I do. You guys, today's topic is probably the touchiest topic that I've ever wanting to delve into or even explore. Mainly because I wanted to educate myself and not just kind of jump in and start running my mouth. And so in order to really understand, because, it's like as a kid and just growing up, even in Pakistan and even the U.S., you hear so much about the Israel and Palestinian conflict, but you never really got the opportunity, especially being somebody, who is not from the region, that you actually just kind of, you hear so many things, in the news, but you never really get a chance to get like boots on the ground kind of that perspective. And I really wanted to invite someone today, who was born in Jersey, my old hood, and now resides in Israel. And I wanted to hear his point of view. And I do want to say this disclaimer. This is a super awesome, loving, progressive, just a fantastic conversation that I'm really looking forward to. And without further ado, I'm going to invite my guest, Adar Weinreb-Ep. Adar, welcome, my friend. How are you?
Mona, what's up? How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I know it's 4:00 in the morning, man. So thank you so much for doing this.
4:17 a.m. going strong. All good. It's a pleasure to be here.
This is so great. It's so nice to see you. How was? Did you chug a bunch of coffee, or are you just? Is that the sativa talk?
I'd say, I don't drink coffee. Caffeine doesn't do me well. I took a shower to get my energy going, did a few jumping jacks. I'm not high yet. Yeah. I normally wait till Thursday. The weekend here in Israel starts on Thursday. Right. That's when I start smoking. I smoked a little bit earlier, but decided to at least start the episode in a clear head. But I might have a joint a little bit later. Please. I have my own YouTube channel. I haven't done any high lives there, so you're taking my high live virginity.
Oh, wow. Look
at that. That's
a
pleasure. Yeah.
Listen, it won't be the first or the last time a Muslim takes a Jewish person's virginity and vice versa. So, hey, why not?
I mean, I'd say that's one way to make peace.
That is absolute. Listen, sex always, or like popping cherries is always the best way to make peace. So I'm all about that life,
Amen, sister. Amen.
I'm all about that life. So, Adar, before we delve into, I was going and reading up and doing my research, and I wanted to really kind of educate myself on the Israel-Palestinian conflict and how it started. And, a lot of people who are not from the region like myself are somehow under the impression that this has been going on for thousands of years, which is completely false. So I definitely got educated myself on that. But I want to kind of tell the audience about what your background is and why, and just the podcast that you do, which is incredibly progressive, where you bring in young folks from both the Israeli side and from the Palestinian side to have a very, I would say, fruitful conversation about what's going to happen in the future. So can you give us a little bit kind of a background about, what you do and what you're, why are you so heavily involved in this?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I'm looking at your video quality compared to mine, and it makes me jealous. I just ordered a webcam, so hopefully the next time we go live together, I'll look almost as good and crisp as you, but I'm sorry that it is a little fuzzy right now.
It's okay. It'll clear up. As it goes along, it clears up.
So, I, as you mentioned, I wasn't born in New Jersey. I'd like to mention I was born in New York. It gives me a little more street cred because New Jersey doesn't have a great reputation. But I did grow up in New Jersey, the armpit of America. I grew up there.
I thought Florida was the armpit. But
maybe there's a few armpits, And That said, although I grew up in New Jersey, most of my family is Israeli, and I'm in fact considered 10th generation Israeli, which means my family moved here in 1812, which is around 150 years before the creation of the state of Israel and before the Israeli-Palestinian conflict began. I was raised with deep Zionist teachings. Now, the term Zionism in itself creates confusion. There's two vastly definitions of Zionism, one held by Zionists, which just means believing that Jews have the right to self-determination on their ancestral homeland. But those who oppose Zionism give it a slightly different definition. They view Zionism as akin to Jewish supremacy of sorts. It's about, they see Zionism as a more of a colonialist mentality, not self-determination on one's ancestral homeland. And this is important to clarify, because if you want to talk to somebody on the opposing side and your version of Zionism is so vastly different from how that, a Zionist would identify as, then you're starting at a conversation from such a place of misunderstanding that it's very hard to build common ground from that point. So my deep Zionist teachings had nothing to do with Jewish supremacy or colonialism. It was simply the stories of the Jewish people, how we were exiled from the land of Israel 2,000 years ago by the Romans, and we spent the past 2,000 years in exile in Europe and around the world. And we had many challenges in those 2,000 years. We were persecuted. We were chased from country to country. We had a Holocaust that wiped out around half our population. Yeah. And after 2,000 years, we finally returned to our ancestral homeland. It's a story with almost a beautiful ending, but the story continues that we returned home after 2,000 years. And then there's this other group of people, the Palestinians, who refuse to let us to live in our ancestral homeland. This is essentially, it's a very common narrative that many Israelis will be raised on, and many just Jewish Zionists around the world. And it's not that it's false, right? Everything I just said is true. It's historically true. It's factually true. The thing is, it only accounts for one narrative. It accounts for the Israeli narrative. It's about our return to the land of Israel. It doesn't make much mention of the inhabitants of this land when we returned and how our return affected them. That to us is often just explained as they refuse to let us live here, so they will continue to fight us. If you look at it from a Palestinian narrative, for them, it is a story of colonialism. Right. They're a population that's been living on a piece of land for many generations, and then come people who are lighter skinned than them. They look quite European. Yes. Although, genetically, if you look at, the genetics of the European Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, who were the ones who began the Zionist movement at the end of the 19th century. Sorry. Yeah. Their DNA is actually traced back to the Middle East thousands of years ago. So it's not quite Europeans, but they're lighter skinned. So there is the story of colonialism, of these people coming and colonizing the land. It's quite easy to understand why Palestinians would view Israelis as colonialists, because from their perspective, it looks very similar. There is, I would say, two main differences. One, we're not a colony of any host nation, right? Nobody sent us here to extract the resources and bring it back to a host nation, which is essentially what colonialism is. But also there's the aspect of, we're an indigenous people returning. So while the term colonialist isn't quite accurate, it's still easy to understand why that is how we're viewed to the Palestinians. Now, these two narratives are vastly different, right? So we have a conflict, potentially the most complex conflict in history. Yes. And it's one that involves differing histories, cultures, religions, and narratives. Now, things like religion and history, we can't change or expect people to change. But narratives is something that we could work to unify, and I think that's really should be, one of the foundations of how we approach peacemaking is working on taking these two distinct narratives and building one unified narrative. Right,
absolutely. That was a fantastic intro, Adar. So thank you so very much for that. I want to talk about the word Zionist. Okay, so it's it's interesting because whenever I have conversations here with a fellow Palestinian or even a fellow Arab friend, and the word Zionist or Zionism has a very demeaning or has a very kind of an extremist point of view attached to it. It's like, some people say, don't confuse Jews with Zionists, right? Just like don't confuse Islamic terrorists with Muslims. And those comparisons are made, but I'm listening to you and I'm listening to where the origin of the word was, and what what the perception of it has become. Is that just that word is basically been, I guess, the perception on it has changed, not from the Israeli side, of course, from like the Arab side, is mainly because of the conflict that has come into place. Is that like an accurate statement to make?
Yeah, I would say, that new definition of Zionism is certainly a result of Zionism creating a struggle between two populations. So yeah, if Zionism was returning to land that no one inhabited, it would remain, a non-offensive term that just means the right for Jewish self-determination on their ancestral homeland. What you mentioned, people say, I don't have a problem with Jews, it's Zionists. That's a way to kind of separate anti-Semitism from anti-Zionism. Mm-hmm. So that's essentially what they're doing. They're trying to say, I don't have a problem with Jews, I have a problem with Zionists. But there's a strong claim to be made that to be anti-Zionist is to be anti-Semitic. And I'm not making this claim, but I think it's it's strong enough that I could present it. It's widely agreed upon that most people do deserve a homeland, right? No one's going to tell Germans that they don't deserve Germany, or French people that they don't deserve France, or Americans that they don't deserve America. So it's viewed as a great double standard. To be anti-Zionist is essentially to tell Jews that they don't deserve a homeland while all other populations do. Mm-hmm. So that in itself is it's a double standard. It's holding Jews to a different standard than you're holding many other people. Mm-hmm. Now, the claim could be made, but, Zionism caused the suffering of Palestinians, so how can I support that? And that's legitimate, right? But it's two separate things. So we could support Zionism, we could support Jews having self-determination, but also be against inequality, oppression, any form of violence, right? These things are they're not mutually exclusive, right? So we could hold both these views, and looking at the injustice that was created when a nation was born to justify whether that nation is legitimate is also a double standard, because most nations were born through bloodshed, right? Unfortunately, it shouldn't have been the case, but that is the reality.
Yes.
So again, often anti-Zionism is viewed as a very strong double standard. It's saying other nations can have a homeland, Jews cannot. Often the reason is because it caused harm to another population, but that's not inconsistent with how many other nations were born. So the claim is hold Jews to the same standard as all other nations, and if all other nations deserve a homeland, then so do the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, I was looking at like just the history of it, right? About like how in the early 1900s, in the first decade of the 1900s, the European Jews were arriving in what was back then known as British Palestine, which brings me to the point about how whenever the British show up anywhere, they destroy that region. And that also goes to my background of being Pakistani and what they did to India, right? India was this massive country, and then the British came and fucked the whole thing up, as I believe that they have done in the Middle East. I mean, literally, they just kind of created this mess and we're like, we're out of here. Okay, see ya. Have a good time. And now, there are two groups of people who are just in direct conflict with each other, which really is heartbreaking. I was reading about how the British were limiting Jewish migration in the 1930s in response to Jewish militias being formed because they were fighting at the time, both Arabs and the British. Did you have family members? I mean, because you were saying your family's been there since like the late 1800s. Did you have family members who who were part of this, possibly this militia, or do you have his stories like that? Because I love stories like that.
Yeah. So I don't know if I had any family members in any militias. I do know that my family was here at the time. There's no stories that I know of, but I did have family members who have fought in just about every single war Israel has fought since its creation. And my grandma, for example, was in Jerusalem when it was surrounded in 1948, and there was a siege on Jerusalem, and I remember her stories of saying she had very little food. She would eat bread dipped in olive oil. That was her food for a few months, I believe it was, which is interesting because my other grandma, who is not Israeli, I heard stories of her also starving as a child because she's a Holocaust survivor. So it's interesting that, on both my grandparents' sides, there's deep trauma from a young age. And, I think this is an important point because trauma is multi-generational. It doesn't, it passes through our DNA. Okay. And, Jews have very deep-rooted trauma because of what we faced in Europe with the Holocaust and prior, and which has been reinforced through wars and terror attacks that we experience. And Palestinians as well have deep trauma from their very harsh reality for the past 70 plus years. Mm-hmm. So it creates an even greater challenge because the people living here are not, we're living here. We're the best people to solve the conflict because we have the most to gain from peace and the most to lose from war. But that being said, many view it through a lens of trauma, which does not always give you the clearest sight as to what the solution is, right? So it's a challenge because no one knows what it's like to be an Israeli better than an Israeli. No one knows what it's like better than a Palestinian But sometimes there might be benefit from somebody who can take a step back and look at it more objectively. Mm. They may find clarity that people who are so close to the conflict may not find. And this is actually, I view this as a challenge in social justice causes in general. Mm-hmm. Let's take a controversial topic. Let's take the BLM movement, and not to confuse it with the BLM organization, because I know there's immense critique over the organization, but the movement is a quite global movement for racial justice. Yes. Similar to this, many Black Americans have trauma from what they've experienced. Similarly, the claim could be made that, there's a great sensitivity, and rightfully so, for non-Black people to comment on the issues of Black people, right? That often creates some kind of a trigger, and rightfully so. Nobody wants to hear how outsiders think you should view, how you should solve your conflict. But with the same logic to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I actually view it as quite similar, that I think people who themselves might not be currently oppressed and have faced certain injustices that many Black Americans have faced might have a level of clarity being one step back from the conflict. Now, I use this as an example. I realize that these words may be extremely triggering to some people to hear, because I'm essentially saying that people closest to a conflict might not be best to solve this, but I reached this conclusion being an insider of a conflict and seeing how many of my brothers and my Israeli and Palestinian brothers and sisters don't always have the cleanest approach because of how close they are to the conflict.
Sure. I mean, mainly because, just like you said, I mean, there's so much trauma on both sides that they're both kind of coming from a place of pain, right? It's like saying one party is saying, well, I'm in pain, and the other party is like, well, but I'm in pain too, you know? And they're like, my pain is bigger than your pain. It's like, no, my pain is big. And it's like, it kind of becomes like this kind of whose pain is bigger. I can only understand it from, I guess I can relate to it from the whole India-Pakistan side. That's right. You rolled that joint, Adar. I kind of approach it from the India-Pakistan side where, I mean, look, so many of the Indians that I meet in America, they're just like, dude, this is nonsense. We're all exactly the same people. I'm not going to fight over it. But there are others on both sides that are like, no, they did wrong to us. And the one side is like, they did wrong to us. And it's like, dude, somebody, just like you said, needs to take a step back and be like, how do we look at the bigger picture? This is not sustainable, right? These ongoing battles, these ongoing fights, these ongoing putting up the walls, Israel doesn't have the right to exist or Palestine doesn't have the right to exist. That's in the long run just doesn't work. It just doesn't. You have to find some kind of peace. I was listening to the UAE chief deputy because he was talking about the recent Israel-UAE deal that went down. And I was listening to him, and he said something that I really agree with the kind of stuff that comes out of the mouth of the Khaliji officials. But I agreed with him. He said Iran keeps saying death to Israel, death to America, right? But that is not the way of the future. Like, you can't be neighbors, or you can't constantly wishing death upon something that because you don't like them because of whatever your personal fucking reasons are, because your country is ran by a bunch of extreme mullahs, right? Like, you can't come from that point of view. I mean, same goes for Palestine. I am a big believer of a two-state solution. I believe that both parties have the right to coexist. Also, I think for me, the one thing that I always find it quite amusing is that is so much of Islam and so much of what Islamic preachings are comes from Judaism. I mean, so much of the stuff as Muslims that we practice comes from Judaism. So it's fascinating to me that people who are so similar, not just religiously, but also I feel culturally, would have such great conflict. But again, I can relate to it going back to being, to the India and Pakistan thing, where it's just like, you guys are the same freaking people. It's like saying Advil and ibuprofen. Same shit. Stop it. Stop the fight. Like, it's not necessary, right? But I feel like India-Pakistan has a complex history, but I feel like Israel and Palestine has even a deeper complex history. It's like, it is probably the most complex thing that is, I would say, right now in the world, besides America being the second one, given the current president that we're facing.
The American quagmire, yeah.
Yeah, American quagmire, indeed. I mean, we are in deep shit. But, you were talking about your grandmother being a Holocaust survivor, and I've met a few Holocaust survivors here, and their stories are just heartbreaking and one of just such courage. I had never met a Jewish person till I was, 18, 19 years old. Never met a Jewish person in my life, right? And this is a true story, okay? In Pakistan, we have a handful of Jews, actually. We have a big Jewish cemetery from the very city that I come from, Karachi, because at one point there were Jews who resided in that part of the city. And we have a Jewish cemetery. And one of the things that I was kind of raised around was these Jews. And I was like, who are these Jews? I've never met a Jewish person in my life. I don't know what that culture is about. How can you point a finger at something or someone that you've never met? How do you come up with that? That, it's stupid. It's so ignorant, right? And when I moved here, I met the first Jewish person I ever met was a Russian Jewish girl. and she was amazing, right? I met her. She was beautiful, so kind, and I was like, what are you? I was like, are you Christian? Like, she's like, no, I'm Jewish. And I was like, tell me more. Like, tell me, I want to know everything about it. And some of my dearest friends now are Jews, which is quite fascinating. I have Arab friends too, and I have Jewish friends because I'm somebody that likes to be friends with everyone, and I want to know everything about their culture. But I want to go back to the history of Holocaust and what was happening. So I was reading up about how around when the Holocaust was happening, that of course, European Jews were fleeing, and they were heading over to, what is now Israel and what was Palestine at the moment. And the United Nations, of course, devised a plan that they wanted to form a Palestinian state and an Israeli state. Do you think? I know the United Nations stepped in, but I want to go back to total basics. Do you think the British fucked up?
So that's a good question. Before I get to that, I just want to wrap up the last topic because it's a sensitive topic and it is likely to create some amount of confusion and even trigger. So I just want to wrap it up on the issue of outsiders potentially having an important perspective.
Yeah.
So the approach to this, because it's not that outsiders should decide the fate of people struggling. It's about a coalition between people struggling and those who genuinely care about their struggle. It's about a partnership and a collaboration. So I just want to make that clear. I do genuinely think that people who are a step back from a conflict have perspective that those in a conflict do not have. But that doesn't mean it's for them to decide the fate of those people. It's a cooperation. One is living it. One has the most to gain and lose. And the other may have perspective given their vantage point here. So I just wanted to sum that up because I think it's an important point. Do I think the British fucked up? I do. I'm not huge on history.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm not huge on history is because I think that it's immutable, right? We cannot change history. Yeah. I'm more focused on the ideas for what we need to do given our present situation to solve the conflict.
Sure.
That being said, from what I do know about the history, I think the British fucked up in many ways.
Yeah.
They were all about control, and part of control was divide and conquer.
Sure.
So the land of Israel, before it was promised to the Jews by the British in the Balfour Declaration, they promised it also to the Palestinians, and I believe they also promised it to the French. Right? It was to make everybody happy. And if we look at the borders of the Middle East and of Africa, it's borders that were drawn up by the British based off not cultural lines, ethnic lines, often control populations and extract resources from those countries. And that creates a whole bunch of turmoil, right? You could have one country, a border splitting between one population and putting that population in a country with another population. That creates sectarian violence. So this is more of a broader overlook of how British imperialism has messed up both the Middle East and Africa. And something similar did happen here in Israel with making promises, deciding borders. It doesn't work. It didn't work.
Yep.
Can I say that there wouldn't be a conflict if it wasn't for the British? No, I'm not convinced that's the case. I think that I can understand why Jews wanted to return. It's similar to why any indigenous people would want to return. For 2,000 years, in Jews' daily prayer, they mention returning to Jerusalem, returning to the Holy Land. So that's there's wanting to return from a religious perspective, from the indigenous the indigenous perspective as well. Yeah. And I think that returning to a land after so long, when there's another population already inhabiting this land, is going to create conflict.
Sure.
Also, Middle Eastern mentality is very tough. It involves a lot of honor. And I think honor culture is important. If we want to understand the conflict, we need to understand, as I mentioned, not only narratives and trauma, but also the culture of the Middle East. Mm-hmm. One of the biggest criticisms and concerns many Israelis have over Palestinians is their unwillingness to compromise. If you speak to most Israelis, they will mention, we've tried to make peace. And I think that this is an interesting duality, right? So there's a huge imbalance of power between Israelis and Palestinians, but there seems to be an imbalance of intent, looking the other way. So Israelis will often, point to many instances where they've been very willing to live side by side with Palestinians and Palestinians having a state. And then there's been rejection after rejection after rejection and an intent to destroy Israel. Mm. So, some, people who take a pro-Israel stance will say, look, the Israelis have been willing to compromise. Palestinians haven't. Palestinians have, indiscriminately been trying to kill people and do whatever they can to destroy Israel. If the Jews wanted to do the same to Palestinians, they have the power to do so, and they haven't. So this is like a very, pro-Israel way to look at it, that they want to kill us. We just want to live here side by side, and we're willing to accept them here. The Palestinian side would be like, they have all the power. They are in control. They are responsible for our suffering. Yeah. These are both accurate claims, right? They're not contradictory. It's just we need to, part of building the unified narrative is accepting both of these claims. Yeah. But if we look at, if we want to understand one of the reasons why Palestinians have been, it's been hard to find a compromise with them is because of honor culture that is prevalent in the Middle East. Palestinians have been killed and persecuted and humiliated by Israelis. So it's not just about, there's a deep sense of needing of justice, and that justice, it takes the form of revenge in many Palestinians, and any compromise is compromising with someone who created a massive injustice. And I think the amount of honor that exists in many Middle Eastern cultures makes it harder to find that compromise. So I think that's also an important aspect to understand if we want to understand the dynamics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Do you? So you asked me about the British, and we ended with honor culture. I don't know if that. No, it might have been the joint, or it might have made perfect sense how we got there. But they have a song called "I Blame It on the Alcohol." I say you blame it on the joint. That's a new song that I'm going to come up with. Look, you are way less likely, to do stupid shit when you're high than when you're drunk. Those are facts. If we look back at our worst moments, the moments we regret the most, it seems like a fair amount of them involve alcohol. Very few of them involve weed. Very few, at least for me. I think mine are usually being sober and dating losers. I think that's okay. Yeah, that nothing to do with alcohol or weed, for that matter. I wish I could blame it on either one, but that is not my story. Sadly, I wish I did. I feel. I agree with you about the fact that it's not even so much about kind of thinking about the history, but more about where do we go from here? Like what happens now? I was reading about one of the prime ministers of Israel who was assassinated. You know who I'm talking about, right? Wasn't it a Israeli prime minister who wanted to make peace and then he was assassinated? Yeah. The closest we ever were to peace was in the early 90s. Again, I'm not as coherent when it comes to history. It's just not. I haven't studied this as extensively, but it was the Oslo Agreement.
That's correct.
It was the closest we've ever been to peace.
Yes.
Both Israelis and Palestinians.
Yes.
It seems like the majority, I don't have the number, but I think on the Israeli side, it was certainly the majority, felt like peace was close.
Yes.
Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister at the time, was assassinated by a far-right Israeli who assassinated him because he was willing to compromise. And we actually spoke about compromise. So we see an unwilling to compromise on both sides. But the far-right Israeli who killed Rabin views every inch of this land as Jewish land by God's word and backed by history. And they believe, and there are a fair amount of Israelis who have this belief. It's not an uncommon view in Israel.
Yeah.
Most of them are not radical enough to kill a prime minister.
Sure.
But at least one was, and the prime minister was killed, and that did derail the peace process. Sure. Can I say confidently that there would have been peace had he not been assassinated? No. This is a challenging one. But
why do you say that?
Because we've been close, and it's so complex. I mean, we're still living amongst each other. There wasn't a full agreement.
Yes.
Jerusalem was still ours. The Palestinians who were kicked out of their homes in 1948, tens of thousands of them would not have the right to return to their home to their homeland. So these things were not part of the deal. Israelis saw it as fair enough. Many Israelis supported, but I think many Palestinians were not so happy with this deal because it didn't give many of them the right to return back home. Many saw it as too much of a compromise with your mortal enemy. And Jerusalem would still be under the control of Jews. So I'm not super optimistic, had Rabin still been alive, or had he not been assassinated, that it would have worked, because there's still a large group of Palestinians, and as we see, a fair amount of Israelis that were not on board. And it's quite possible they would have been able to disrupt the peace agreement from happening, which did happen. It was disrupted. And I think it could have been disrupted in other ways had it not happened this way.
So you're saying even if it went through, it still wouldn't have been able to sustain the peace that,
Yeah, look, let me give you a clear example. The deal could have been signed, and then there could have been violence. The next day we could see terrorist attacks in Tel Aviv, and there were following the Oslo Accords, following Rabin getting assassinated, Israel saw a wave of terror attacks, and I don't want to get facts wrong, so I'm going to stay vague on the facts. I don't know, but so let's imagine a situation: terror attacks begin because some amount of Palestinians are not on board with the deal. Well, Israel would respond with potentially then taking the deal off the table, or increasing security, or as Israel has very methodically found ways to take more and more land. Right, the military occupation the Palestinians live under is quite horrible for the Palestinians, and often a lot of that has been justified as a retaliation or as a consequence of continued terror attacks. So that's just one example. Had some group of population not agreed to it, they could have responded in violence. That violence could have collapsed the agreement. So it seems in order to find peace, it's not only about the nations, the governments finding peace, it's about enough of both populations agreeing.
Right. That's right.
And if enough of both populations don't agree, it seems like they have the ability to stop a peace agreement in its tracks. Sure. So it's not just governments agreeing. There needs to be true social change. There needs to be a new unified narrative, and that's really what it's all about. Having the narrative and the plight of the Palestinian people be understood clearly by all Israelis. and vice versa. Have Palestinians understand the Jewish connection to this land and our difficult history that eventually led us back here.
Yes.
It's about Israelis learning Arabic and Palestinians learning Hebrew. It's about having some kind of reconciliation process, which probably, and reconciliation is, I think, is a concept that's not discussed enough in conflict resolution. I think also if we go back again to the issue of racial justice in the United States, I think reconciliation is extremely important there, and it's not mentioned quite enough. But reconciliation is certainly needed here, and that could involve just a mutual recognition of each other's narratives, a mutual recognition and apology for the pain we have created each other. Not individual pain, right? Individuals refuse to accept that they are guilty. Most Israelis have not personally harmed a single Palestinian, and vice versa.
Sure.
But our nations caused harm to one another. Yeah. And having the nation be able to apologize to one another, seems like it would have immense healing capabilities. Yeah. So reconciliation is important, and probably some kind of a national holiday where we celebrate our unity.
Yes.
Together, where we celebrate our love for the land together. And I'd say that those are a few good steps to reconciliation. I'm just one guy. I think that one of the greatest shames I see is that we have so many resources on this land, so many brilliant minds, both Israelis and Palestinians, and it seems like the majority of the focus goes in the wrong directions, right? We're spending a fraction of the energy thinking of ideas for peace and connection, and what a comprehensive and empowering reconciliation process would look like, right? These aren't the conversations happening. It's talking about how we could have better weapons, better defense, better strategy. That's where so much of our people's energy is going, and it's really a shame. So, part of my work as an activist is to try to build this unified narrative, try to get people's energy away from militarism and division and fighting and over to unification and reconciliation. So that's really what I'm trying to focus on.
I think, honestly, it's so commendable what you're doing in your activism work, and to even sit here and have this conversation. I feel it takes a very evolved human being, a very compassionate human being, to sit down and be like, okay, I know I can talk about my pain, but let me step outside of my pain and let me hear the other person out. Right? Let me see what they're experiencing, because I was watching some of your podcasts and your episodes because you interviewed Noam Chomsky the other day, which is amazing. Yeah,
that was fun.
He's fantastic. I was listening to it and I was just like, wow, you really bring on like young people from both sides. You want to bring on, because if you really look at it, it is really the young people who would lead us to peace and progress and come to table and have reconciliation, which is the conversation we just had. Do you feel, Adar, like this narrative that your AC's not working?
Yeah, it's on heat. I'm wondering why I'm hot. And
yep.
No, I'm with you though. I'm with you.
Is the kind of conversation we're having right now, your narrative and about like bringing both parties to the table and having some kind of reconciliation and understanding what it's like to be like the other, is that a popular narrative in Israel? What is that like? Are you frowned upon when you bring it up? What is that like, in among the Israeli folks?
Yeah, so there is not a great conversation on this. It's not taught in our schools. It's not part of Israeli culture to have this conversation. There is no pride in being a peacemaker the way there is pride in being a soldier. Not even close. And I think a sign of us being in the right direction, or a sign of us being close to achieving peace, is when that flips, and when we view those who are working to make peace as heroes. Today, they are, by and large, either ignored or ridiculed to some extent. People just think it's naive. There's a great pessimism on both sides. I think it's something like only 11% of Palestinians think peace will be attained in the next 100 years, and I think it's only 20% of Israelis, something along those lines. Wow. So, that's a sign of deep despair, and despair, breeds violence and hate. So, Israelis are viewed as naive. The more extreme people will view them as
naive by who?
Well, amongst Israelis, it's not uncommon for an Israeli to think the work I do is naive, and they might be right. I'm just a dude trying to make peace. My approach to peacemaking is not I'm going to bring peace to this land. Not at all. I think that's a problematic approach if activists take. Because you give yourself a little bit too much importance, but also then you're very likely to be let down. For me, activism is just every individual doing their small part in making a difference. And if we all take that approach, then we will make a difference. So that's really what it's all about. But many Israelis think it's naive. Peacemakers are ridiculed. In Palestinian society, it's a little bit more challenging and the stakes are a little bit higher. There, because of the power dynamic, there's a very strong anti-normalization movement. And essentially what anti-normalization is, it's saying you do not normalize ties with your enemy. You do not normalize ties with your oppressor. That's essentially what anti-normalization is. And that makes a lot of sense. It's like, why normalize ties with somebody who is causing you so much harm? It's almost like accepting the harm they are causing you. That being said, because we've identified that, a great part of this conflict is our inability to understand each other's narrative, that it seems like some level of normalization is essential. The path to peace is paved through the humanization of the other. Yeah. So we need to have some amount of normalization, because without that, we can't get to know one another. We can't build a unified narrative. Yeah. But that said, anti-normalization is very strong amongst Palestinian society, and their peacemakers have a much greater threat than being ridiculed or considering themselves naive. They are sometimes in danger of their neighbors and their own government. The Palestinian Authority arrests peace activists and locks them up for normalizing. What? Normalizers are interrogated and locked up. If you are, tonight I was in an awesome meeting done by an organization called The Home. They're trying, it's an organization trying to work on a unified narrative. And it was a group of 10 Palestinians, 8 Israelis. We met in the West Bank in Area C, and we had a great conversation, about, and we had obviously disagreements, but just a great conversation to build more common ground and to see what we can do to really inspire our communities to join this movement. Sure. And we took a picture at the end. We uploaded it, but every Palestinian, aside from one, has their face blurred because they requested. And they have their face blurred because that's how high the stakes are for them. Wow. For Palestinians in Gaza, it's even worse. In Gaza, Hamas is in control. Right. And they're a bit more extreme than the Palestinian Authority is, even though neither of them, I think, in their current state can be viewed as a legitimate partner for peace. Yeah. Nor do I consider the Israeli government currently a legitimate partner for peace, given their policies and how they've behaved the past probably decade or so, maybe even more.
So the people sitting in power, Adar. So people sitting in power.
Okay, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Are just not willing to come to the table and have any kind of conversation. Like, first of all, there's a massive communication breakdown, right? That communication breakdown has been there for years and years. And then on top of that, Hamas is, of course, that is definitely sits on the extreme side. Then there's the Palestinian Authority, which I thought I was somehow under the understanding that the Palestinian Authority would at least try to come to the table and create some kind of narrative or some kind of conversation where it's not so full of conflict, but it sounds like that's not the case at all.
Mona, I got lost in thought for a minute.
Okay.
That we could blame on the sativa. But in general, I struggle with that on a day-to-day basis. I love conversations, but I do have moments where I get lost. Can we roll that one back 2 minutes? What were you saying?
It's all right, man. That must be some good sativa. I'll tell you that much. That must be some good sativa. I got you lost in thought.
No complaints.
I thought it was just my eyeshadow, but it's apparently sativa. I was saying that you were talking about how, it just sounds like people who sit in authority, whether it's the Israeli government or you're talking about the Palestinian Authority or Hamas, is a very different conversation. But I was somehow under the impression that at least the Palestinian Authority would want to create some kind of dialogue or some kind of conversation where it's like, hey, how do we find a place to peace? But it sounds like even the activists on the Palestinian side are afraid for their lives because, just like you said, there is an anti-normalization. So anyone who talks about peace or wants to bring forth that narrative is thrown in jail. So what happens to these folks that they get thrown in jail? Like, do they get killed? Like, what happens? So
it's first of all, it's just super demoralizing, right? We need more activists on both sides. And when we see courageous Palestinians rise up and then get punished, and then they're not likely to return to their activism, that's demoralizing for anybody who's involved in the peace process. What happens to Palestinians in the West Bank who are under the Palestinian Authority? They'll get interrogated. Sometimes they'll get locked up for a few weeks. One of the guys that was at our meetup tonight, he was locked up for 2 weeks from the Palestinian Authority for being in contact with Israelis. If you're a Gazan, then the stakes are much higher. So. Right. Gaza is under Hamas's control, and I have a friend from Gaza. His name is Rami Aman. He's a very courageous activist who's was constantly in dialogue with Israelis. He was on my podcast at a point, and around 6 months ago, he was arrested by Hamas, and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison for having conversations with Israelis. That's heart-shattering in so many ways for his life and for just understanding that he's not going to get out of jail and continue this work. He's not going to get out of jail and continue to convince his Palestinian.
Even, right? That is, even if he makes it out alive, are they going to leave him alive even?
Yeah. So I don't know much about the Gazan prison system, but I'm under the impression that he's going to come out alive. I don't think I don't think he's going to get executed. There's some amount of international pressure that has been pressuring Hamas for his release. I have been asked not to speak about this publicly. Well, here I am speaking about it publicly, but at least not to my network, because it was thought that if Israelis are coming out and speaking up for Rami's release to gain international pressure, it would look bad that Israelis are coming out in support for him. So here I have a friend who, I have spoken to him in public, right? We've been part of this peace building process, is now locked up, and I need to just deal with it silently. I can't yell and make noise and tell the world what is happening. Yeah. And it hurts, it's not easy. My heart breaks for him and his loved ones. Yeah. And, even when he gets out, I'm not sure if we'll ever speak another word in our entire lives because of the threat. Now, I don't want to be pessimistic. I think I'd like to think that within my lifetime we could have peace, and Rami and I could travel. I could visit his home and he could visit my home, and we could go to the beach together and eat at a restaurant together, right? That's the dream. That's what we're working towards.
Yeah.
But there's no guarantee that that's what's going to happen. That's what we need to be working towards.
Yeah, absolutely. Adar, so that is happening more. So let's say Ramin gets released from Gaza, from the Gaza prison, and if he decides to get up and uproot himself and go live in the West Bank, A, can he, and B, would Hamas still have access to him to try to pull him back or to bring him back? Like, how does that work?
They can't pull him back, but they don't need to let him leave, right? So it's up to him and Israel if he's allowed to leave. It's very very difficult situation for the people in Gaza. They need permission from Hamas to leave, and they need permission from Israel to leave, and you know that most Gazans have never left Gaza. It's a quite horrible situation. There is actually also a border with Egypt that you don't hear about. You know, Israel's often made to seem as the worst, the worst country in the world, and many Israelis take this as a form of anti-Semitism and just unfair treatment. But there's a border between Gaza and Egypt, and that border is even stricter, supposedly, than the one with Israel. I mean, that's besides the point. But the idea is life in Gaza is quite terrible. If Rami makes it to the West Bank and he's under control of the Palestinian Authority, Hamas doesn't have the means to take him back. That being said, Hamas is, in a sense, not Hamas, the Palestinian Authority is, in a sense, a puppet dictatorship currently in the West Bank. There haven't been elections, I believe, in 12, 13 years in the West Bank. Abu Mazen, aka Mahmoud Abbas, has been in power all that time. There are no elections. Polling does show that if there were elections, Hamas would win. Israel is helping keep the Palestinian Authority in power. That they kind of control the Palestinian Authority. They give them funds, and they with their military able to make sure Hamas doesn't gain a military presence in the West Bank. So essentially, Israel's keeping the Palestinian Authority, in power in the West Bank, because the alternative they view as much worse. And the status quo is, for all too many people, and many people in power, because their power is a result of the status quo, they're comfortable enough with the status quo, and it's keeping the Palestinian Authority in power, even though they have not been a partner for peace, seems to be the best solution to all too many people in positions of power. It's not like other alternatives are being approached. So, right, that's worth mentioning.
I have a question here from my regular watcher, James. He says, question for Adar. He said, there is speculation that if Trump loses the election, that Israel will go ahead and annex the West Bank because they know that Biden would never agree. Your thoughts?
So, first, I guess, let me give my opinion on the U.S. election. I know people are going to be upset by this, but I have a feeling Trump's going to win, and I think it could even be a landslide. I'm just putting that out there. I have been wrong in the past, but that's what I'm feeling. Yeah. If he does lose, though, would Israel then annex? I mean, that's a tough one. I don't think so. I'm not even convinced that there was ever a real plan for annexation. Many would disagree with me on this, but I'm not convinced. I think the annexation was used as a way for Benjamin Netanyahu to maintain power. He needed a larger piece of the right-wing vote. Netanyahu is considered, to most people, a right-winger, but there are a few parties to the right of Benjamin Netanyahu, and he often appeals to them right before elections. And plans of annexation is a great way to appeal to those people. He used the threat of he used annexation as a way to help get reelected, and then he used it as, in a sense, a bargaining chip to make peace with UAE. I don't think And that being said, I don't think UAE really cares about annexation. They just needed a way to agree to peace with Israel and make it seem like it wasn't for nothing. So it's kind of like a clever move. It's like, let's pretend we're going to annex, and then the UAE can use that as the reason why they agreed to peace, because we took that off the table. That's kind of what I think happened there. I don't think annexation will happen, but this is just an educated guess. I really don't know.
Okay, that's all right. I hope that answers your question, James. I've never been to Palestine or Israel. I would love to one day, God willing. How easy is it to travel from Israel to West Bank and vice versa? I'm not even going to touch Gaza because that's a Hamas control.
Yeah, Gaza is a challenging one. If you are, for an Israeli, I can drive. So the West Bank is split up into 3 areas, Area A, B, and C. Area A is under full Palestinian Authority control. Area B is dual control between Israel and Palestine, and C is under Israeli control. So we can travel freely into A and B, I believe, without checkpoints on the way out. There is a checkpoint. Upon them seeing that you're Israeli, they'll let you in fairly easily. Area A, Israelis are not allowed to enter by law. This is law that is put forth by the Israeli army, by the Israeli government, because of just the threat of going in there. It's an area that Israel's military is not present in a way that can keep people safe. So it's off limits for Israelis. For Palestinians to travel into Israel proper, which is, let's consider everything after there's the West Bank in Israel proper, which is the 1967 border. So for Palestinians to move from the West Bank into Israel proper, depending on where they are, they're going to have 1, 2, 3 checkpoints just to get there. And they will need some kind of permission in order to enter. They need a permit to enter. They sometimes get 24-hour permits. You could sometimes get a week permit. There's ways to get permits, but that's what it's needed for Palestinians to go into Israel. It's much, much easier for Israelis to go into Palestinian territories. For outsiders,
so if I'm visiting and I'm like, first I land in Tel Aviv, and then I'm like, oh, I want to go visit West Bank. Like that, how difficult is that process?
Yeah, so I think it's fairly easy for most outsiders. So most outsiders can arrive to Israel, no problem. They could enter, and then from there they can enter the West Bank. They don't need a special permit. They can enter. They could actually also enter Area A.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'd say you can come and visit all parts of the land. There have been in recent years, and this is a quite shitty policy. Israel started banning people from entering the country if they support BDS or other pro-Palestine organizations, which is just such a sign of weakness, and that you don't feel comfortable enough with that. That's at least how I view it. It's like you shouldn't feel like some activist who doesn't think you should exist is a big enough threat that you need to bar them from entering. There's probably only been a handful of people who have been barred the past few years, but there is a policy like that, which, it's Netanyahu government policy that's quite stupid in my opinion. That doesn't serve much purpose, doesn't in any way help. I mean, if anything, letting people who dislike Israel come to Israel just for them to get to Palestine, that's getting to know Israelis, seeing them as human beings for potentially the first time, seeing that we're not these murderers, how we're often pictured in the media. So, it seems like letting activists in, regardless of what they think about us, can only help.
Right. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I feel like, these conversations Adar, do you, as a peace activist in Israel, do you feel any kind of threat, or is that something from the Israeli government where they might come after you or say you can't say that or we're going to jail you? Do you have a similar kind of a threat, for you versus what the Palestinian activist would experience?
No. There's no threat like that. There's no legal repercussions. There's only just minor social repercussions. Possibly amongst more radical Israeli population, they may view me maybe as a traitor, but I'd say that's a very small minority of Israelis. Most Israelis, when they hear what I do, some are like, yeah, that's cool. Others think it's just, naive trying to make any difference. It's too much of a challenge for any individual to make a difference. That's how it's constantly viewed, but there's no threat. Got it.
But on the Palestinian side, forget about what's happened, what Hamas is doing in Gaza. But on the Palestinian, it's interesting to me how, just like you said, that the Israeli government wants to keep Mahmoud Abbas in power, mainly because the alternative is a really bad idea. But the Palestinian Authority somehow has these laws where they're punishing or at least trying to, Palestinian activists who want peace. So does Israel not have any influence on Palestinian Authority when it comes to that kind of sort of thing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know if the Israeli government cared enough. Can they stop it? Can they find leverage to stop it? But potentially, I don't think they're trying. I don't think they care enough. I don't think they think that Palestinian activists are going to make a difference. The status quo is comfortable. Many Israelis in power are equally pessimistic to the general population. It's not like the people in power have these grandiose ideas for how to solve the conflict. For them, it's just about kicking the can down the road, maintaining the status quo, and staying in power. Once you're in power, you don't want to let it go, and again, this isn't universally true, right? There are people in power who are genuinely well-intentioned. But I think often when you're in power, you begin to see things differently, and you start to focus more on what will keep you in power, not what will make your people live better lives. And I think that's a struggle we see in governance, across the board in all nations.
Right, absolutely. What first of all, how long ago did you start this your activism work, and what even got you into it?
So I had an interesting evolution story. I, being raised with those Zionist teachings, after,
in New York, right?
In New Jersey, yeah. Growing up in New Jersey. Right. Since I was a little boy, my dad, who's Israeli, who served in the army, his brother served, his father served. He said, when you grow up, you'll go to the army. It was exciting, this idea that I'll go serve my country, protect my people. And when I was, and I still never made a conclusive decision, but in high school, I was quite a big troublemaker, and the army just seemed like the perfect escape from a crazy lifestyle I was living as a high schooler, just a way to straighten up and also serve my people. So I moved to Israel when I was 18, and I joined the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. And my views were vastly different than what they are right now. I knew the narrative I earlier explained. We are here to protect. We are here trying to live in peace, and they want to kill us, and we just need to protect ourselves against them. That's what I knew. I wasn't taught to hate Palestinians, not by any means. I was just taught that if we don't defend ourselves, they will kill us. And interestingly enough, in the army is when I had a realization that started changing my views over time. I was guarding on base, and people often think of soldiers as like Rambo. Most Israeli soldiers are between the ages of 18 and 21, kids who want to be as far away from military base as possible. They're just trying to pass their 3 years so they could travel and be free.
Smoke some sativa.
Yeah, and there's a fair amount of soldiers that do. There's a fair amount of soldiers that do, but most of them wait till after the army, take some trip around the world, and that's when they start experimenting with all the fun stuff. That's generally how it goes.
Yeah.
So I was guarding on base and I was bored, and there was a poster on the wall that showed Hamas training techniques, and there was a Hamas soldier crawling through sand. And I was crawling through sand that same day, and I looked at that soldier, and I saw myself. I saw myself in my sworn enemy. I started asking myself, I said, if I was born in Gaza, would that be me? Could that be a loved one? Does his family view him as a hero and me as a terrorist? Mm-hmm. Can that be?
Mm-hmm.
Now, these thoughts didn't change my views overnight. I mean, deep-rooted ideologies can take many years to change, but this certainly planted a seed in my mind, and that seed over years, grew into what I consider a garden of compassion and understanding and humanization. And I got released from the Army in 2011, and, I had a few years for my thoughts on the conflict to evolve. And then there was the Gaza war in 2014, where Israel went into Gaza. Lots of Gazans were killed, around 1,000. Over 100 Israelis were killed, some who I knew. I've lost already a few friends, either to in the military or to terror attacks, and most Israelis have. And it's a small country, so every time someone's dead, someone gets killed by a terror attack, you could look them up on Facebook and you see all your mutual friends with them. It's very rare that somebody dies and I don't have a mutual friend with that person. Wow. And same goes for the Palestinians. Sure. Virtually all Palestinians know someone who's been killed by this conflict. And war broke out, and I saw two narratives online, two very distinct narratives: Israel under attack, Israel under attack. And then the other narrative was Gaza under attack, Gaza under attack. And it was wild. Nobody was saying Israel and Gaza under attack. No one was recognizing that you have two populations who are currently fighting, but both are suffering, both are in pain. It was one against the other, one or the other. And, I said something needs to change. We can't continue like this. Something needs to change. And I just started writing Facebook statuses. That's really how I started. I just started writing statuses on Facebook about the humanization of the other and how we should look at this as all of us together suffering and not one against the other. And, that just grew to different initiatives. I started getting involved with different NGOs and helping promote them. Before I got into activism, I was actually a club promoter for years in Tel Aviv. I used to manage teams of promoters. We would bring all the internationals. Being an international myself, we'd bring them to all the clubs and have great parties. Wow. It's somewhat related because through the work I did as a club promoter, I actually realized how I could use my social media to promote parties. I'm like, if I could use it to promote parties, can I promote other things? Can I promote ideas? So I started utilizing social media to promote peace as well as parties. And that kind of grew into all sorts of stuff. And then I finally launched my YouTube channel and the podcast, and I've done some other cool videos, been involved with some interesting initiatives. So I've been doing that for the better part of 6 years now. Wow.
That's, that is a, I'm listening to your story, and it sounds like a story of enlightenment. It sounds like a story of you having a spiritual journey and answering questions for yourself, which I feel a lot of people shy away from because it's a difficult journey and it's a lonely journey, right? You're probably alone in those thoughts when you're like going through it and you're just like, oh my God, I am surrounded by people who probably not going to like what I have to say, but I'm going to find the courage to talk about this and hope that they will accept what is it that I'm saying, or at least hear me out for what I have to say. And first of all, kudos to you for even standing up and speaking out and having this level of compassion, not just for your own people, but for the people who are sitting across the aisle and also are in pain, just like the people on your side. It's very rare that you come across people like that. So you were talking about, you had a meeting today with these Palestinian peace activists. So did that meeting take place in West Bank? Is that where that meeting took place?
Yeah. Yeah, that was in the West Bank. And just to make, a quick comment on what you said, I do consider it an enlightenment. And I think that, a fundamental truth I like to live by, and there aren't many fundamental truths I live by. I've worked hard to really unravel most ideologies I have, and try to truly accept ignorance and work from that place, work from trying to reconstruct ideas based off assuming I don't know anything.
Yes.
But rationality can only take you so far, right? You need some value to follow.
Mm.
Rationality, you could look at it as the steering wheel. Values are the compass. So, the value of just viewing all life as inherently equal and
sacred
and worth maintaining.
Sure.
Understanding that compassion is just an essential part of elevating human well-being here on planet Earth. And taking that one step further, it's not just about humans, it's about the animals as well. It's about the ecosystem. We part of the immense privilege we have to be humans with such immense capacities that so vastly different from all other animals, and to be alive in the 21st century where we have so much technology and so much privilege compared to, virtually anybody who came before us, that's, we're in a place where there's no reason why we can't protect all other life forms, not only all other beings. So that's the value that I kind of approach my activism for.
No, I mean it's a beautiful place. It's a very enlightened place. Like I said, I think it's really beautiful. When I moved from Pakistan at the age of 15, I went through about 10 years of identity crisis. And the reason I went through identity crisis is because I didn't really know where I belonged. I didn't know if I was American or if I am Pakistani or am I, how Muslim am I? I think all of those things kind of really, and I feel like it's only when I took that, it's only when I took that spiritual path, that individual, very difficult spiritual path, have I been able to come out on the other side and kind of have my own enlightenment to understand of, my spirituality is about and what my enlightenment is about. So when I meet fellow enlightened people like yourself, I appreciate them a lot because I understand how difficult that individual spirituality path is, and it's a hard one. And of course, then your coming out party and understanding, like, oh my God, people, are they going to even embrace what I have to say? And thank God, I get shit thrown at me from fellow Muslims, but I get shit thrown at me from conservative Christians too. So there's also that. What is the future of Israel and Palestine, Adar?
I'd say no one knows, but we have the power to influence what that future looks like.
Mm-hmm.
I alone cannot bring peace to this land. No individual alone can bring peace to this land.
Yeah.
But collectively, if people rise up and start to work together, and this will take great courage from both people, but primarily the Palestinians, who will need to rise up. And the way to stop Palestinians from being arrested is for them to rise up in masses, in numbers,
mm-hmm.
And begin, a mass approach at reconciliation and humanization. And I think, that's what every individual can do, and start electing for electing leaders who share this vision and these values. And, that's what I think every individual can do to impact change, not only in Israel and Palestine, but in every conflict in the world.
Sure.
It's essential to remember that you have the ability to inspire change, and, take that opportunity, make this chance at life that we were given, and make it truly amazing by not only fulfilling your aspirations, but trying to get a win for humanity while you're at it.
Right.
And Mona, I see you as part of this process. You're doing excellent work, and, I appreciate what you're doing.
You're very sweet, Adar. Thank you. I try to, I think my biggest fear about having you on as a guest was to not not to overstep or not to say something insensitive, because it is a very sensitive topic to a lot of people. And, just trying to educate myself and have as much arsenal in a good way of information to not basically come across like a dumbass is what I've been taking my.
Well, I think you did a great job.
But thank you very much. I'm trying. I am so motivated to come to Israel and Palestine now. I honestly have always kind of shied away, mainly because of all the stuff you hear in the news, but I'm listening to you and getting this really fantastic perception that I did not know existed, which is why I'm so grateful to have come across you and now have you on as a guest. Do you feel, the people on both sides, on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side, you said, the majority of the people are kind of sticking to this. I feel like they're sticking to the painful narrative. Right? It's the narrative of pain. It's like, that person's my enemy. Keep them away. I don't want anything to do with them. Let's just put up the wall. Stay away from me. If you try to hurt me, I'm going to shoot you. Right? What helps people? What makes people step outside their pain and say, how do we objectively look at this? How do we come to the table and have a conversation of some kind of compromise where this is not about us, but this is about the future of our children?
Psychedelics.
I'm about that life, man. I haven't done them.
Look, I mean, that's an easy answer, right? So I said
it isn't easy. I'm just like, how do you do that? That's so complex. Oh, you got on mute there, Adar.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes.
My mic got unplugged. Yeah, I mean, you asked.
Sorry, before you answer that, one of our viewers, Aziza, said, "Thank you, Adar. I learned quite a bit of your perspective." And she also said, "Yes, and God will help eventually." I pray to God that is the case. Yes.
Thank you, Aziza. I'm grateful you're here with us. So, you asked a very challenging question. I gave an easy answer, which is not a one size fits all. I mentioned psychedelics because, you asked the question of how do we step out of our pain and see a different perspective. And psychedelics is one of the single best ways to do that. That being said, it's not for everybody. Sure. It's still illegal. So I don't want to tell everybody to go start doing them, but consider taking psychedelics. I would say do your own research, but be open to the idea that you can benefit from taking psychedelics. I did. Part of my evolution was taking psychedelics. Without a doubt.
Really?
Without a doubt. Okay. That being said, let's look at other holistic approaches, because we're talking about being able to have that form of enlightenment that we discussed earlier. How do we get more people to be enlightened and take a step away from the pain and their conflict and view things more rationally and more compassionately?
Yeah.
So I'd say any amount of healing work. I think this could be group sessions between Israelis and Palestinians. It could be little meetups where they come together and talk. There's an organization I've been involved with called Minds of Peace. They bring Israelis and Palestinians together to do public negotiations out in the public.
Wow.
And, I said we need mass amounts of Palestinians to rise up. So when the organization just began, they saw that bringing one bus filled with Palestinians was difficult because the Palestinians feared being targeted. But then once we scaled and brought 10 buses, it was much easier because they felt security in numbers. And we've had the biggest one we did was here at Rabin Square, named after Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister who was assassinated, because that's where he was assassinated. We brought 800 Palestinians and 800 Israelis together to sit at multiple tables and negotiate the peace process. That's one of the single best ways to take you out of your narrative and begin the humanization process.
Wow. Adar, can we just talk about that for a second? How was that? Like, when was this? How was it? And what was the kind of result from it? So,
extremely powerful.
Yes.
It was extremely powerful. It's inspiring. It makes you feel hopeful. Many Israelis have never met a Palestinian. Israelis meet many Israeli Arabs. Some of them identify as Palestinian. I mean, keep in mind, there are 20% of Israel's population are Arabs.
Wow.
With Israeli citizenship.
But they're not Palestinian.
There's actually no difference. It's in 48. Some Palestinians were either left their home or were kicked out of their home by Israelis. Some were allowed to stay. The ones who were allowed to stay became Israeli Arabs and have full rights under the law as Israelis. Sure, there's some amount of racism and discrimination, but full rights under the law, and many communities of Israel, Jewish Israelis and Muslim Israelis living together in peace and harmony. Israel is also a very diverse place, way more diverse than people think. We could talk more about that if you'd like, but
I'd love to.
So it's not uncommon for Israelis to know Arabs and live amongst Arabs, but Palestinians who identify as Palestinians, most Israelis have never met a Palestinian or have a Palestinian friend. Most Palestinians have no Israeli friends. The only Israelis they will meet are soldiers or settlers, and most of the time, neither soldiers or settlers treat Palestinians with dignity and respect. So, their view on Israelis is not that we're nice people.
Yeah.
Many Israelis view Palestinians as violent and wanting to kill us, and then you seat them in front of each other for the first time, and they get to know each other as human beings. That can break down years of education and preconceived notions of one another in a single day. So that is an extremely powerful experience. And I think it's one of the single best ways to progress the peace process. It's just not so easy, especially now with COVID. Entries for Palestinians into Israel have been closed off. So much of this work has stopped, but it is an initiative that exists. It's not common enough. It needs to be brought into our schools from a young age. Young Israelis need to meet young Palestinians. We need to have, sports that we play together, trips that we take together, right? There needs to be more communication from a young age, but it's happening, and we just need more of this. We need more of this work.
Yeah, absolutely. So you guys had this massive gathering, so that the Palestinian Authority didn't try to come after the people who came in and had this conversation, who were attending this? Like, the Palestinian Authority didn't come after them?
No. We got 800 permits given by the Israeli army. They're the ones who grant the permits. Which is a huge deal. Getting 800 permits is not easy.
Sure.
And, it's possible some of the Palestinians got some flack from their neighbors.
Sure.
But when you have that amount coming out, the Palestinian Authority is not going to now start interrogating 800 people. It's too big a number. So they kind of let it slide. That's what seems to have happened.
And this was how many years ago?
So the big one was 2017, I believe. 2016, maybe 2017. But since then, there's been one every 2 months. Not that size. They're normally smaller, 20 people, 50 people, sometimes 100 people. Sometimes we do youth panels, and sometimes we do all women panels. And interestingly, the youth panels and the women panels often do a better job at reaching solutions than the all-man panels or the mixed panels.
That's how we roll, Adar. That's how the ladies throw it down.
Well, I don't like to talk much about group differences just because it opens doors to prejudice. But women on average, and it's important to say on average because we do need to view the individual, but women on average are higher in empathy, and when you're higher in empathy, then you're going to reach conclusions quicker. So I'd say there's a clear explanation to why that exists.
And which brings me to the next point, which I've been wanting to actually ask you, is has Israel ever had a female prime minister?
Yep. We had a female prime minister, Golda Meir, in the 70s, believe it or not. So,
wow.
Yeah, we haven't had one since. We've had Tzipi Livni, who was close. She came fairly close around 12 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, Israel, in many ways, it's definitely leading the region as a progressive nation. We have multiple pride parades every year. We have a huge pride parade in Tel Aviv every June. Yeah. This year was canceled, but huge pride parades. We have many women in high positions of power. Yeah. And many Arab Israelis also in positions of power and in the military and judges. That's the good, but there's an ugly side to it. There's definitely still prevalent misogyny. Rape culture is very much, alive and well in Israel.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, rape culture, that's similar to rape culture that we see in America, where, victim blaming, slut shaming, demeaning behavior towards women if they're sexually open, calling them sluts, that all those.
That's a global thing, Adar. That's just a global, undying phenomenon.
So we have that here, and Palestinian culture, I'd say, is a fair amount, less progressive on social issues currently. Part of that could also be a result of the conflict. We have seen that, people in conflict become radicalized, but, it's, if you compare Israel to most other countries in the Middle East, we're a fair amount more progressive when it comes to social issues. But as we mentioned, rape culture alive and well, racism towards Arabs and our Ethiopian Jewish population alive and well, right? There's still, I'm not going to sit here and make it seem like we're where we need to be when it comes to social issues. No, we've done great in a historical context, and on a global average, I think we're doing great. Yeah. But as an Israeli who wants to make this land better, we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Was Golda Meir conservative or liberal? What kind of party did she kind of belong to?
She was right leaning. She was considered right leaning. I don't know too much about her policies, but she's held in high regard in Israeli society. She's very, very well respected.
Yeah, and I believe on the Palestinian side there has never been female leadership. Am I right about that?
Yeah, no, there hasn't been. Not even close, I would say. That being said, in these public negotiations, we do have a fair amount of Palestinian women coming out, and many younger women, under the age of 18, high school girls coming out to these negotiations, and I mean that's so inspiring because they don't come and sit passively. No, they are assertive. They take a stand. They are loud. They make their voices heard. And the first time I saw that, I was surprised because, there is repression of women in Palestinian culture and in most Middle Eastern cultures. It's fair to say that there's a lot of work to do when it comes to how women are treated. Again, I'd say Israel is in the lead by a fair amount, but Middle Eastern culture, by and large, there's a lot of repression of women. So I was actually shocked to see, the amount of women and how vocal they were and confident in their voices. It showed me, a side of Palestinian culture and Palestinian women that I've never seen, and also got me to question that, I guess to some extent it's not that all Palestinian women are repressed and don't have a voice. No, that voice didn't begin at that table, right? These are women who came in with the confidence to speak and share what they believe and how they feel. So, that was a sign that there are, many empowered women, Palestinian women. And one of the biggest peace organizations in Israel is called Women Wage Peace. I'd say it's probably the biggest peace organization. If you look at it in terms of numbers, Women Wage Peace is number one. And they have a great slogan. They say, left, right, and center, unite for peace. So they're making it apolitical. They're saying this isn't left wing, right wing.
Yeah. This
is humans. This is Israeli women taking a stand saying we need to solve this conflict. It's beautiful.
It's It's so powerful. Like, I'm just like listening to you, and I'm just trying to picture like 800 people from both sides, like seeing each other for the first time at a table and having a face-to-face conversation. So how long did this last? Was this like a whole day event? Like, what was the event like?
Yeah, so the negotiations are normally a full day. It's kind of hard to get people back into action after lunch. Lunch kind of kills the momentum.
Yeah.
But it's like a challenge we find with the negotiations. We plan lunch for like 2 p.m.
Who's paying for the lunch, Adar?
It's the NGO. They're called Minds of Peace. So I'll look them up. They have a Facebook page, I think a YouTube page, a website. Minds of Peace, awesome organization.
Amazing.
But it's a good 6 hours of sitting there, and it's structured too, right? Different tables are approaching different aspects of the conflict. Some are talking about borders, some are talking about prisoners, some are talking about right of return, Jerusalem, reconciliation, ending violence, mutual recognition, right? So there's different aspects of the peace building process. Different tables are meant to address different issues, and then they kind of work on building a consensus together. There's so much to address, you never get to it in one sitting, but what we've seen is that Israelis and Palestinians, when they come together, make peace better than our politicians. So that really says something.
But Adar, it goes back to the point that you were making, which is it's the people that have to want it, right? It's the people that have to want it, and then they go on and say, hey, you know what? This leader that I have right now is not working because they don't reflect my ideology, right? And the fact that you're saying that you have people from the Palestinian side who are like kids who are under the age of 18 and sitting at the table and having these confident voices and voicing their opinions and saying, hey, we want peace. Like, how do we make this happen? This is how the progressive ideology, or any ideology for that matter, spreads, which is it's on such a grassroots level, right? It's the kids who are just like, look, this is not cool. Like in America, I'm sure you know this, we have a whole woke culture, right? It's the young people that are taking matters into their hands and saying, look, it's not cool to bash women. It's not cool to bash LGBTQ communities. It's just not cool. Like, you can't say shit like, oh, boys will be boys. Well, that shit is not accepted anymore. Fuck that. Like, we're just not going to be a part of that culture. We're not going to keep perpetuating that if we want to progress and be a better society. So I feel like, when you tell me this kind of thing, I feel like that's exactly what's happening in a more, that kind of wokeness is happening there, where the young people are like, we want to have these conversations. Like, we don't want to constantly be living in conflict. It's incredibly powerful, the kind of stuff. I'm like so inspired. I'm just like, man, there needs to be like NGOs, and I bet there are, who are working both on the Pakistani and Indian side and saying, guys, we need to cut this crap out. Like, stop it. Like, we're the same people. Like, how do we have these kind of peaceful negotiations, these peaceful conversations? I mean, it's really powerful when I listen to you. I know it's getting a little. It's already 4:00 in the morning. Actually, now 5:30 in the morning for you. So we're gonna start wrapping up. So Adar, do you have your podcast that you do? Are these like daily episodes that you put out, or weekly episodes? What's your thing?
So I have a podcast called Standing Up, and that's a pre-recorded session where I interview activists and influencers from around the world. Mona, you're actually going to be on the show. I believe we're doing that next week, so look out for that episode. I released that on my YouTube channel, which you could type in if you search Adar Weinreb, which you can see my name right there on the screen, somewhere over there.
Yep, I see it.
And the name of the channel is called The Great Debate, but you're more likely to find it if you type in Adar Weinreb. You'll find the channel The Great Debate. That's where I upload the Standing Up podcast, in addition to the Standing Up podcast, which is a video form as well, so you could watch it or listen to it. It's on Spotify, Apple, all the platforms. Then I have a show called The Great Debate, and that's a weekly live stream where I bring on people with differing opinions together. We try to find common ground. I call it a debate because if I called it a discussion, less people would watch it, but it's not a debate where sides are trying to defeat one another. It's a debate where people are working together to find common ground, and that's what makes it a great debate and not a regular debate. Yeah. So I do that every Thursday, 7 p.m. Israel time, which would be 9 a.m. PST. I go live. Tonight I didn't because I had that meetup, but next Thursday we're doing something special, so tune in for that. Yeah. And then sometimes I just upload other fun content. I'll sometimes talk on an issue and upload it. I don't know if maybe not fun's not the right word, but inspiring content, we call it. Thought-provoking content.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's what I'm doing in the world of content. If anybody's watching this and wants to get in touch, Mona, maybe my contact information is there. If not, maybe put in the description. You guys can reach out to me.
Already.
It's there. So Facebook, Instagram, email, even reach out to me. I'm always happy to engage in dialogue. Ask me questions. I'm happy to respond. So. And
it's all at Adar Weinreb, right?
Yeah, Adar Weinreb across the board. You should be able to find me on all the platforms.
Got it. This has been a really it's very good for my soul, this conversation today, Adar. It's really, really amazing. So thank you so much for staying up late and having this conversation. It really means the world. So thank you so much. And I'm super excited about being on your podcast next week.
Yeah, Mona, it's been a great pleasure. I appreciate what you're doing, and I appreciate you having me on. And you mentioned you now want to come visit Israel and Palestine. Well, I'm giving you a personal invite. We spoke a lot about the conflict. I didn't get to speak enough about how awesome this country is, how much awesomeness there is here, why are people fighting over it? Because it's fucking awesome.
Yes.
We could get into that, in a different talk, but there's so much.
This is not the last time you're coming on. You're going to come back again. So, and
sure.
The next time you come on, we're going to talk about the awesomeness of Israel.
Sure.
So this is not the last invitation, Adar, by any means. You're going to be coming back on quite a few times. So the door is wide open for the invitation for you to come back anytime. So I'm definitely going to bring you back on, and we're going to definitely delve into that. But I know it's definitely getting late for you, so I'm not going to keep
6 a.m.
6 a.m. Holy, okay, please. You know what? Get some sleep, my friend. This was great. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Mona.
Thank you. Take care. That was the wonderful and lovely Adar Weinreb. I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I learned so much. I didn't not so scared about the topic so much. If that's I don't know if that's a strange thing to say, but I definitely feel a lot more empowered listening to him and learned so much about both sides. So thank you so much for tuning in. Tomorrow, same time, 6:15 Pacific, I have a fantastic guest on by the name of Rachel Kona. Rachel is an amazing writer, entrepreneur, and blogger. She's a South Asian woman that does a lot of hilarious sex pieces. Yeah, she writes a lot of funny shit about sex. So I'm very excited to interview her tomorrow. If you haven't followed me on YouTube, please do subscribe to my channel. I have a lot of exclusive content there you can check out. Guys, have a good night. I will see you tomorrow. Please don't forget to follow my friend Adar on his Instagram at Adar Weinreb, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Have a good night.